Hey guys, today we're back to discuss something that I totally missed out to discuss before it went live. Um, so this is about the 6v6 orb penalty. So if you're a ball holder, I'm pretty sure you've already noticed you get squishier um, as you're holding the ball in Magic Prison or in 6v6. The other one is the skill damage adjustment that we have in PvP or GVG. Um, both of the I decided to tackle these two things in one video because of two reasons. They both came out at about the same time, around May 18th in CBT, and the second one is because they're important to one another. It kind of gives context on how you should build your character in when you want to compete in 6v6. So yeah, again, before we start, usual disclaimers. I'm not a professional developer. I'm not a programmer, and everything I'll be talking about today is just solely based on my understanding of the in-game codes and my personal gaming experience. Also, big thanks to Team Leaks for always doing the good job in the community. Okay, well, let's get started then. Okay, so for everyone who knows or who has been playing competitively in 6v6 or anyone who's an orb holder, you're probably already aware that there's a debuff whenever you hold the orb. I mean, apart from those that we already know, which is you can't hide, your movement speed is restricted. But basically, after the May 18th update in CBT, and I totally don't know when they applied it in Seiya, but basically, there's another debuff that they've added, which is 5% reduction in your skill damage reduction. So people may be asking, how does it work? What's the max? How frequently does it get added? And so, based on the description, it gets added every 5 seconds. And now, when you look at the code, um, the buff code that's being used is 210011. It's negative 5% or negative 0.05 on skill rest, and the limit layer, which is the value that decides how many stacks you can get, is capped at 20. Now, what this means is you can get a maximum of 20 stacks, which is equivalent to 100% reduction in your skill damage reduction. Now, that 100% is not relative to your skill damage reduction, it's a 100% reduction, which means if you have 10% skill damage reduction at 20 stacks, you basically have negative 90% skill damage reduction. Now, what does that mean, right? I mean, does it mean that you shouldn't invest in skill damage reduction? Can your skill damage reduction even go negative? The answer is yes, your skill damage reduction can go negative. It's the same concept with penetration and damage reduction, wherein if your damage reduction goes negative, it kind of feels like your enemy's penetration went higher because they tend to deal more damage. It's the same concept with skill damage reduction. And so the answer is yes, you should still invest in skill damage reduction, because if you have zero of it, it basically means you have negative 100% after 20 stacks. Now, there's a caveat here, there's some context here, and that's the reason why I decided to discuss these two things in one video. Now, the next topic, which is about the adjustment on skill damage on PvP and GVG, actually affects this item a lot. And so, yeah, just long story short, right? 5% reduction every 5 seconds, maximum of 20 stacks, which is all in all 100%. If you've been holding the orb, you haven't been dying, then it basically means you get 100% skill damage reduction at the end. Now, this is also one of the reasons why some of the popular ball holders right now are those that have invulnerability frames, because after an extended period of time, you're just so squishy, even mediocre DPS will probably not have such a hard time in putting you down. And so that's why those invincibility frames are those that are really helpful, because once the fight or once the battle drags on, you get more affected by this debuff, but then if they can't target you or if they can't hit you, then this debuff is basically useless. Okay, now on to the adjustment for skill damage. Now let me just preempt, because I know the next question that's going to come up after this discussion is whether the same thing applies to normal attacks or to auto attacks. Now the answer is no. This is just for skill damage, or skills specifically. Now, as you can see in the code, right, the highlighted section is what got added. Now there is a computation for actually skill res. Kind of funny how they coined it, but that's a variable they used, which basically takes in your skill damage reduction and subtracts from it the skill damage increase of the enemy. Okay, so for example, if you have 0 skill damage reduction and your enemy has 50% skill damage increase, then the value of actually skill res is negative 50%. Okay, now this portion, right, is applicable, right? This actually skill res that you see here, right? This is PvE and PvP. Okay, we're gonna expound on that a little bit later, but just do know that this portion still applies to PvE concept. Now, this next portion is only in PvP, which basically means if they're in PvP or in a GVG map, what's going to happen is it's going to put a limiter into the value of actually ski res, which basically means that if the value is lower than -1, right, or negative 100%, then the value will be -1 or negative 100%. If it is higher than 1 or 100%, then the value will be limited to 1 or 100%. Anything in between will retain its original value. And then afterwards, it's going to go through the second line of computation, which basically is just to clean the decimals, right? Or, it's just basically going to trim the numbers. And then the next portion is where, the actual adjustment happens. So actually ski res becomes actually ski res plus 0.4 multiplied by 1 minus the sign of actually ski res multiplied by 3.14 divided by 2. I did discuss this in my damage reduction video, and if you do want to get more context from this computation, I suggest you check that up. But what this basically means is it changes the actual effect of the value that you have. Now, if an enemy has 0% skill damage reduction and you have 50% skill damage, it no longer just multiplies it by 50%. Something else happens and you get a different result. I'm going to go to a oversimplified graph later, but that's the whole idea of it. Okay, now the result of actually ski res then will get used to determine or to compute skill end. So you see the skill end is equals to 1 minus actually ski res, right? And then skill end is equals to math.max skill end, or 0.15. Basically means that it can't go lower than 0.15, which is the floor value for skill damage. Okay, now let's try to look at how this actually looks like. Okay, so here's an oversimplified graph of how this formula basically plays out. Right? Now, if you've been following along, you do know that the value of skill end, or the actual skill multiplier, right? The skill damage multiplier, the end result, hinges on the value of actually ski res, which is, again, your skill damage reduction minus the enemy skill damage increase. Now, just to keep everything simple, I plotted this based on the skill damage reduction always being 0 and the skill damage increase, stepping up from a range of -100 all the way to +100. So, just to keep it simple, right? Now, if you look at the x-axis here below, that's the value of actually ski res, which is from -100 all the way to +100. And then skill end is your y-axis, which basically means at the lower it is, right, the lower it increases. Basically means a value less than 100% actually is a net reduction. A value more than 100% is a net increase. Okay, now I want you to look at the 0 point, right, wherein skill res minus skill dam is equals to 0. As you can see, even at the net 0 percentage, the net increase, rather decrease, is 60%, which means instead of dealing 100% because it's 0, you're only dealing 60%. So there's a net reduction of 40%. This is already a big thing, right? I mean, just off the bat, without doing anything, right? If your damage and your reduction nets out to 0, then you still get about a 40% reduction. Already a big thing. Now, if you look here on the negative side, wherein the damage increase is much higher than the skill damage reduction, you would see that even at the negative 100%, the actual increase is only 20%, right? The net increase is 20%. And then as you go and move towards 0, as the opponent's reduction increases, or as your skill damage increase reduces, you go lower and lower. So which means, theoretically, right, if your enemy has 0% skill damage skill damage reduction, and you have 100% skill damage increase, you'd only be doing 20% more. So let that sink in. So with that, right, that's actually the reason why I wanted to discuss these two things in one video, because even though you get a huge amount of reduction in your skill damage reduction as you're holding the orb, there's a very big buff in terms of how the skill damage gets computed. Again, because this doesn't apply to auto attacks, auto attack types are unaffected by this. But I think you've already seen it, right? It's now the third week of Magic Prison, 6v6 rather, and you see that people still deal decent amounts of damage, and that really just shows how before there was a lack of foresight on how the actual damage would just go on astronomically higher. But yeah, with this, at least it did balance out a bit. Obviously, if you're still fighting, some of those strong guys, especially Thanatos and AAMs, you'd still feel like you're kind of squishy, but it's only because they really deal tons of damage. But yeah, with this adjustment, certainly it will, I wouldn't really say totally alleviate the debuff on holding the orb, but it somehow doesn't put you at such a strong disadvantage, and it still is a level playing field. So yeah, I know this is late, so sorry for that. Didn't have enough time because of a busy work schedule, but hopefully you learned something new out of this, and see you in the next video. If you do have any questions, do let me know. I do read the messages, I just don't respond all the time. But yeah, if I do have time, I'll try to make more of these videos. Again, thanks everyone, and you have a nice day.